The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby at 3:11 a.m., the kind of sound that only existed in hospitals and interrogation rooms. Megan O'Brien had learned to stop hearing it 3 years ago, the same way she'd learned to stop answering to her real name, the same way she'd learned to make herself invisible. She moved through the ICU corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston with the kind of practiced silence that came from a decade of moving through war zones where sound meant death. Her scrubs were blue, anonymous, forgettable. Her badge clipped to her collar read simply M. O'Brien, RN, with no rank, no service designation, no proof of what she'd been before the Pentagon erased her and told her to vanish. The night shift at Sacred Heart was a careful choreography of keeping her head down. 3 years of it. 3 years of accepting the medication assignments nobody else wanted, working the graveyard hours when the senior nurses didn't come in, keeping her hand steady when they started to shake. She'd become the kind of nurse that supervisors forgot to schedule meetings with, the kind of employee who blended into the tile and the beeping monitors and the smell of antiseptic that never quite covered the smell of human suffering underneath. That was the plan. That was the only way to survive when the army had decided you were a security liability instead of a decorated officer. When they decided that your actions during a classified extraction in Marjah had made you too inconvenient for official record. Megan was checking the medication cart on the 3rd floor of the ICU when the trauma alert came through the intercom, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm of securing vials and double-checking dosages. The alert was routine, another car accident, probably, or a fall, the kinds of injuries that kept emergency rooms busy on Friday nights in Houston. She didn't look up. She'd learned not to look up. Looking up meant seeing things. Seeing things meant remembering things. Remembering things meant her hands would start to shake, and shaking hands made people ask questions, and questions were the one thing she couldn't afford. The EMTs wheeled the stretcher past her station at 4:02 a.m. One patient. Male. Approximately 60 years old, muscular build despite age, the kind of body that came from decades of physical discipline. No identification on him. The chart was sparse, found unresponsive near the Buffalo Bayou Park area, brought in by someone who'd called 911 and then disappeared. The trauma team was already moving him to the ICU's isolation bay, the kind of treatment they reserved for patients with infectious disease protocols or for patients whose circumstances were unclear enough to warrant containment. She shouldn't have looked. That was her first mistake. Megan's eyes drifted toward the stretcher as it passed, just a glance, the kind of unconscious movement any nurse makes 100 times per shift. The patient's eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow, assisted by an oxygen mask. His right arm lay across his chest, and on that wrist, on that narrow, scarred wrist, was a single dog tag on a broken chain. The chain had snapped at some point, the metal bent and twisted, the dog tag hanging by a thread of remaining links. She could make out the engraved letters even from 6 feet away, JV, followed by a service number that she'd memorized 11 years ago in a briefing room in Kandahar. Her hand stopped moving. The vial she was holding, morphine, 10 milligrams, a standard sedative, hung suspended between the cart and the small red sharps container. The fluorescent light seemed to get louder, or maybe that was her heartbeat, or maybe her entire nervous system was screaming at her to move, to look away, to do anything except what she was doing, which was standing frozen with recognition crystallizing in her chest like ice forming on still water. Colonel James Vickers. The man who'd court-martialed her in a hearing that officially never happened. The man who'd sat across from her in a tent outside FOB Shank with 3 other officers whose names were redacted from every document, 3 other men whose faces she could still see with perfect clarity, and who'd listened while she explained the call she'd made during the extraction at Marjah. The call that had saved 18 lives. The call that had killed the mission. The call that had made the Pentagon decide the whole operation was politically inconvenient and buried everyone involved, everyone except the 5 people in that tent, everyone except the people who'd been ordered to vanish and start new lives with new names and new identities that couldn't be traced. Megan forced her hand to move. The morphine went into the sharps container. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, each gesture exactly what it should have been except for the tremor that had started in her fingers and was now spreading up her wrist like electricity. She set the medication cart in place and closed the drawer with careful precision. Around her, the ICU continued its work. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Ventilators wheezed. Shoes squeaked against the polished floor. A nurse 3 bays over laughed at something on her phone. The hospital continued being a hospital, and the world continued not knowing that it had just shifted on its axis. She needed to see him. She needed to read his chart. She needed to confirm what she already knew with absolute certainty, that the mute patient in Isolation Bay 4 was Colonel James Vickers, the man she'd thought was thousands of miles away, the man she'd spent 11 years not thinking about, the man whose face she'd buried so deep in her memory that she almost didn't recognize him, except she recognized him immediately, the way she would have recognized him after 50 years. Megan moved toward the patient documentation station with the same measured pace she used for everything. Invisible. Professional. Just a night shift nurse checking on a new admission. She pulled up the chart on the secure terminal and scrolled through the sparse information. No name. No social security number. No insurance information. The emergency contact line was blank. The medical history section contained only one line: patient unresponsive, unable to provide information, no identification found. The X-ray results weren't back yet. The blood work was pending. The chart had been flagged for hospital administration, which meant someone upstairs already knew this patient was unusual, which meant questions were being asked in conference rooms she couldn't access. She stared at the screen for 11 seconds too long. She knew it was 11 seconds because she counted them, because counting was something to do with her mind that wasn't thinking about the scar on Vickers' jaw or the way his left eye had always been slightly narrower than his right or the voice that had said, "Major O'Brien, we need to discuss your actions at Marjah," in a tent where the temperature was 127 degrees and where the only sound was the oscillating fan trying to push the heat around without accomplishing anything. Having difficulty with the intake. Megan's spine went rigid. Her hands went very still. Dr. Caldwell had moved up behind her with the kind of practice stealth that senior physicians developed after years of intimidating junior staff. He was tall, his coat perfectly pressed, his hair perfectly silver at the temples in a way that seemed calculated to communicate wealth and authority. His eyes were the color of slate, and they were very interested in what she was looking at on her screen. "The chart's incomplete," Megan said. Her voice came out level, professional, the voice of a competent nurse. Not the voice of a major. Not the voice of someone whose hands were currently trembling enough that she had to grip the desk. Waiting on the X-ray and lab results. "Yes, well," Caldwell said, and he leaned closer, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive that came in a bottle from a store where normal people never shopped. "That patient's intake is going to be flagged through administration. All the testing needs to route through my office before results go to the general staff. Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor." He remained there for 3 seconds longer than necessary, his presence making the air feel pressurized, making the room seem smaller than it had been 30 seconds ago. He was studying her. She could feel his attention the way prey animals feel the weight of a predator's gaze. What he was looking for, she didn't know. What he was seeing, she couldn't guess. But when he moved away, when his expensive shoes squeaked slightly on the polished floor as he headed back toward the physician's lounge, Megan realized that something had shifted. That his interest had been piqued. That she'd made some kind of mistake by looking too long at that chart, by standing too rigidly when he approached, by having hands that trembled when she reached down to touch her boot. The combat knife was still there, exactly where it had always been, strapped to the inside of her left boot in a sheath designed for field use. She'd never removed it. In 3 years of civilian life, in 3 years of being a nurse instead of a major, in 3 years of trying to be invisible and safe and forgettable, she'd never taken off the knife. She ran her finger along the hilt now, just a touch, nothing visible, nothing that would show up on any security camera, and felt the muscle memory wake up in her hands like something ancient stirring in deep water. The fluorescent lights hummed. The monitors beeped. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. And in Isolation Bay 4, Colonel James Vickers lay unresponsive, his broken dog tag catching what little light made it through the closed curtain, waiting for something he didn't know was coming. The isolation bay was silent except for the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, the sound of a machine keeping someone alive who might not want to be. Megan had just finished her morning rounds, had documented Vickers' vitals with the same clinical precision she'd maintained for 3 years at Sacred Heart, when she heard Dr. Caldwell's voice echo down the corridor. "Nurse O'Brien." It wasn't a question. It was the tone a man uses when he's already decided what he's going to say, and he's going to say it loud enough for witnesses. Megan straightened, her hands moving to her scrub pocket with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned long ago that visible composure was its own kind of armor. The dog tag she kept there, the one she'd never shown anyone, that she touched sometimes when no one was watching, pressed cool against her palm. Room 407. Mrs. Chen in the bed, her daughter visiting, both of them watching as Dr. Caldwell stepped into the doorway with Megan's tablet in his hand. The chart. Vickers' chart. She'd pulled it again this morning. Just to verify the medication orders. Just to confirm what her instincts had been screaming since day one. "Do you have authorization to access that file?" Caldwell said, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man performing for an audience, "or are you just playing detective again?" The family exchanged glances. Mrs. Chen's daughter pulled her chair closer to the bed, suddenly very interested in the monitors. Megan took one measured breath. In through the nose. The antiseptic smell of the hospital flooded in, bleach and alcohol and something underneath it all, something like copper. She felt the tear form before she could stop it, felt the heat of it tracking down her cheek, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Caldwell. Her jaw didn't clench. Her voice didn't shake. "I'm doing my job, doctor." He stepped closer. His presence filled the room like a pressure change, not the calm authority of someone confident in their position, but the aggressive bulk of someone who needed to prove something. Megan recognized the pattern. She'd seen it in battalion commanders who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, in officers who equated volume with leadership. "Your job," Caldwell said, "is what I say it is, Nightingale." The nickname landed exactly where he'd aimed it. A reference to her constant bedside presence with the mute ranger. A diminishment dressed up as familiarity. A statement to Mrs. Chen and her daughter that this nurse was something other than professional. Something obsessed. Something not to be trusted. Megan set the tablet down on the patient table. Her hands were steady. That was the part that would matter later, that her hands never shook, that she never looked away, that when she spoke, her voice came out like someone reading a weather report. "Will there be anything else, doctor?" He didn't answer. He just left, taking the tablet with him, and Megan turned back to Mrs. Chen with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and resumed her assessment of the patient's foresight as if the interaction had never happened. The daughter watched her the entire time, trying to understand what she'd just witnessed. By Wednesday, everyone understood. The break room at Sacred Heart had its own ecosystem. Nurses rotated through in shifts, grabbing coffee between 12-hour stretches, and on a normal day, there was a rhythm to it, conversations about patients, complaints about scheduling, the kind of professional camaraderie that develops when you spend more time with your co-workers than your families. Wednesday at lunch, that rhythm died the moment Megan walked in with her sandwich. She saw Marcus first, one of the senior nurses, standing by the refrigerator. He looked at her, actually looked at her, and then turned away. Within 15 seconds, 3 others stood and left. One of them whispered something to another as they passed Megan's table. Whispered. Not even trying to hide it. Megan sat down at a table by the window. The TV on the wall was playing a daytime news program, something about a courthouse ruling, politics, the kind of background noise that hospitals pumped in to make spaces feel less empty. She unwrapped her sandwich. Turkey on wheat. She'd made it the night before because she knew her shift was going to be long, knew she'd need to eat something, knew her body would require fuel even if her mind was somewhere else. She chewed mechanically. The sandwich tasted like cardboard. 4 more nurses came in. They looked at her, saw where she was sitting, and instead of joining her or even nodding a hello, they clustered on the opposite side of the room. One of them, Jennifer, who'd worked beside Megan for 2 years, who'd borrowed money for her daughter's tuition, whispered something to another, and both of them looked at Megan. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was coordinated. It was the kind of thing that happened when someone gave an order, and everyone fell in line. Caldwell had said something. Caldwell had implied something. And the entire staff had decided it was safer to distance themselves from whatever Megan had become. She finished her sandwich. She drank her water. She sat there for the full 30 minutes of her break, watching the room fill and empty around her like she was a stone in a river, something to flow around but never touch. No one approached her. No one made eye contact. When she stood to leave, the silence that came behind her felt like its own kind of sound. The disciplinary board was mounted outside the main elevator on the 2nd floor, next to the staff bulletin board. Everyone saw it during shift change. Department updates. OSHA notices. Staff recognition certificates. And now, in the disciplinary section, a laminated sheet with names and offenses. M. The Brian, written warning for compromising patient confidentiality and unauthorized chart access. 20 staff members passed it during shift change on Friday morning. Megan knew because she counted. She'd printed the schedule, had memorized when each department rotated through the main entrance, and she'd stood by the nurses' station and watched them all read it. The surgical nurses. The residents from the trauma rotation. The orderlies pushing gurneys. The cleaning staff who emptied the trash. Her name. Official. Public. Documented. The accusation wasn't quite a lie, which made it worse. She had accessed Vickers' chart multiple times. She had done so without explicit authorization from Caldwell, though the hospital system allowed all ICU nurses access to all ICU patient records as part of standard protocol. But he hadn't framed it that way. He'd framed it as an inappropriate fixation. A breach. A violation. Friday afternoon, Caldwell cornered her at the nurses' station. 3 residents were present, all of them suddenly very focused on their documentation. "You have an unhealthy fixation on that patient," he said. His voice was lower than it had been in room 407, more intimate, which made it somehow worse. More dangerous. The kind of voice a man uses when he's about to destroy you quietly. It's concerning. Makes me wonder what you're hiding. Megan's hands were steady as she set down her tablet. She'd learned years ago that the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the military training she'd tried to bury, trying to surface, trying to tell her body to move in ways that were no longer permitted. She pushed it down. She locked it down. She made herself small and harmless and thoroughly, completely professional. One tear tracked down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with him. "I've been court-martialed by better men than you, Doctor." The sentence hung in the air like a suspended breath. The residents looked up from their paperwork. The charge nurse at the main desk froze. No one understood what she meant. That was the entire point. The word sounded like the broken fragment of a woman who'd been pushed too far, whose emotions were starting to crack through. But there was a layer underneath that, a layer only Caldwell could read. A reference that only he understood. He went pale. Actually pale. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug somewhere, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like a man who'd underestimated exactly what he was standing next to. Then he straightened his white coat and walked away, and Megan returned to her charting as if nothing had happened. But that night, when she came back to the hospital on her own time, using a colleague's badge that she'd carefully noted was never swiped out, she discovered what Caldwell had been protecting. Vickers' medication log showed orders that didn't match his condition. Insulin for a non-diabetic patient. Beta blockers in quantities that would suppress cardiac output. Medications ordered by Caldwell himself, documented in the system, but never appearing in the actual medication administration record because a nurse, one of the ones who'd walked out of the break room, had been quietly failing to administer them. It was the slowest kind of murder. The kind that looked like medical complications. The kind that couldn't be traced. Megan photographed the chart with her phone. Her hands were perfectly steady. When she turned to leave the isolation bay, Caldwell was standing in the doorway. "You're done," he said quietly. "I'm calling security and the board. This is stalking, Nightingale. This is criminal." She didn't move. She didn't lower the phone. She stood there with the photographic evidence of his crime in her hands, and she let him see her face, really see it, for the first time since she'd arrived at Sacred Heart 3 years ago. Let him understand that the timid nurse he'd been tormenting wasn't actually timid at all. "I need you to step back from the door, doctor," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a command. The monitor screaming was the first thing she noticed when she pulled Colonel Vickers' chart that Thursday morning. Normal vitals listed as of 6 a.m., but the medication orders underneath told a different story: metoprolol at a dose that made no sense for a man with a resting heart rate already in the 60s, and something worse underneath it, something that made her hands go still. Digoxin. Ordered but not dispensed according to the pharmacy log. Or rather, dispensed once, then marked returned. She pulled the physical pharmacy records from the cabinet behind the nurse's station, the kind nobody thought to check anymore, and there it was in actual handwriting: digoxin 0.5 milligrams, signed out by Dr. Caldwell at 11:11 p.m. on Tuesday night. The night he'd backed her into the supply closet. The night his eyes had held that calculated precision of a man deciding how much pressure to apply before something broke. She felt the blood drain from her face, not from fear but from the clarity of what she was looking at. He wasn't just trying to destroy her credibility. He was poisoning the patient. She closed the chart slowly, the card stopped making a soft whisper as it sealed shut. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and somewhere down the hallway, machines were beeping their constant mechanical rhythm, machines that had no idea what was happening inside the walls that contained them. That same Thursday, Megan noticed the shift assignments for the following week posted on the board. 3 nurses she'd worked with for months, experienced nurses, people who knew her competence without needing to ask, were being reassigned to other floors. Different shifts. Different units. Not all at once, which was the thing that made it insidious. One moved to pediatrics effective immediately. Another suddenly transferred to the ICU on the West Wing, a floor so short-staffed that half the staff quit every 6 months. The third, Sarah Chen, a surgical nurse who'd worked alongside Megan through the worst days, was reassigned to administrative duties that had nothing to do with bedside care. She watched Sarah's face when she saw the notice, a brief flicker of confusion, then understanding, then something like pity directed at her. Nobody had to say it. The orders came from Dr. Caldwell's signature, rubber-stamped and official, and by the time Megan questioned the assignments during the morning briefing, he'd already distributed the rationale: operational efficiency, balance of expertise across departments, meeting patient census needs. All of it technically defensible. All of it designed to isolate her, to strip away the people who might believe her, to leave her standing alone in a room full of strangers who'd been carefully primed to see her as unstable. The access code came next, a Friday morning ambush timed for maximum efficiency. Megan swiped her badge at the patient information terminal at 7:15 a.m., and the system rejected it. Not a glitch, a deliberate restriction. She tried again. Same result. A message appeared on the screen: your access privileges have been limited. Contact the IT department for assistance. She walked directly to IT, a small office tucked behind the pharmacy, where she found a nervous young man with wire-rimmed glasses clicking through screens. He didn't meet her eyes. Dr. Caldwell had submitted a request late Thursday evening, he explained, citing security concerns about unauthorized chart access and asking that her system privileges be limited to general nursing functions only. No patient records retrieval. No medication order verification. No ability to review treatment plans or cross-reference medications against patient history. No way for her to see what he was doing to Vickers. The young man was apologetic, following protocol, hands moving in small nervous gestures. Megan nodded once and left without speaking. The restriction wouldn't hold up if she formally challenged it through hospital administration, but that would take time. Time was something Colonel Vickers didn't have. Time was what Caldwell had just stolen from both of them. She understood the architecture of it on Friday afternoon while sitting in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. It wasn't random humiliation anymore. It was tactical sabotage designed to accomplish three things simultaneously: render her unable to help the patient directly, isolate her from allies who might corroborate her story, and create a documented pattern suggesting she was exactly what Caldwell claimed: unstable, obsessed, possibly delusional about her military service. He'd moved the experienced staff, restricted her access, stripped her of the ability to verify his orders or contradict his decisions. Now she could see him giving medication she couldn't check, ordering treatment she couldn't review, manipulating a patient's care in ways she could observe but not stop. Every observation she tried to make would go through him or be filtered by nurses who'd been carefully positioned not to trust her. It was the kind of strategy a man with power used when the direct approach had failed. When intimidation hadn't broken her. When public humiliation hadn't forced her out. So he'd adapted. He'd become competent in his cruelty instead of just loud. And that was infinitely more dangerous. The phone call came Friday evening while she was still at the hospital, the tail end of her shift, when she was charting the final vitals. The voice on the other end was cold and official, someone from Human Resources, a woman named Patricia Webb who read from a prepared statement with the careful diction of someone covering liability. Dr. Caldwell had submitted a formal complaint detailing concerns about her work performance. An employee displaying what he characterized as unstable behavioral patterns. Reference to her making unauthorized inquiries about a specific patient's medical history. Concern that she might be fabricating a military background to enhance her credibility. He'd used the phrase stolen valor and let it sit in the silence between them like something poisonous. There would be a formal investigation. She would be placed on administrative leave pending review. She was to surrender her access badges and not return to the facility until the process was complete. The hospital would contact her with the details of the hearing. Patricia Webb's voice never wavered. This was procedure. This was protocol. This was the thing that happened when you were already isolated, already restricted, already framed as unreliable. When no one who could contradict the narrative was positioned to do so. Megan listened to the end of the prepared statement and then heard herself speak as if from outside her own body, her voice steady as a surgical laser. I want to see the formal complaint. Patricia Webb's tone shifted slightly. That wasn't really how this worked. Megan repeated it. I want to see what he wrote. There was a pause. Patricia said she'd email it to her. No warmth in that promise. Just procedure, carefully followed, evidence building, the machine that Caldwell had engaged beginning to grind forward in its inevitable direction. She sat in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot for 40 minutes after that call, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, the Texas heat pressing against the windows like something alive. Around her, the hospital rose 6 stories of glass and concrete, the logo, a cross, a heart, the word sacred beneath it, rotating slowly on the building's facade. Somewhere inside those walls, Colonel James Vickers lay in a bed in the ICU, his chest rising and falling on a ventilator, unable to speak, unable to call for help, unable to tell anyone that the man in the white coat who visited him every morning was systematically destroying him one medication at a time. She understood now why Caldwell had done what he'd done in the supply closet, why he'd positioned himself so close she could smell the expensive cologne over the antiseptic, why he'd whispered those words about court-martials and classified things. He'd been testing her. Measuring her reactions. Calibrating exactly how much she still remembered, how much the past still had hooks in her, how much she cared about a man she'd once testified against. And she'd failed that test by showing too much recognition. By letting her mask slip for long enough that he could see the officer underneath the scrubs. That was when he'd stopped being just cruel and started being strategic. The email arrived at 10:40 p.m., Dr. Caldwell's formal complaint attached as a PDF. Megan read it sitting at her kitchen table, a glass of water untouched beside the laptop screen, her face illuminated by the blue light in the darkness of her small apartment. He documented everything. The moment she'd stared at Vickers' chart too long. Her request to check his medication orders, framed as obsessive behavior rather than standard nursing care. Her comment about court-martial, which he'd characterized as a concerning reference to her own possible psychiatric history. He'd included statements from 2 nurses, not Sarah Chen, he was too smart for that, but 2 others she barely knew, who claimed she'd asked them suspicious questions about the patient's background. He'd flagged her military references as potentially indicative of stolen valor, noting that a background check would be prudent. He'd even included the access code restriction, framing it as a necessary precaution given her pattern of unauthorized chart access. Every element was technically defensible. Every sentence was crafted to suggest not a nurse trying to protect a patient, but a woman unraveling, possibly dangerous, definitely unstable. The kind of person you didn't want near your hospital. The kind of person you removed before she hurt someone. She closed the laptop and sat in the darkness. The pain wasn't the kind she could treat with medication. It was data. Information. Another thing military people understood that civilians never would, that pain was just your body telling you what was actually happening. Her body was telling her that James Vickers was running out of time. That Dr. Caldwell's campaign had accelerated past the point of reversibility. That she was being systematically removed from the field of operation just as her target, her patient, the man she'd both hated and recognized across the space of years and classified orders, was being slowly eliminated. The thing she understood, the thing Caldwell couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that she'd faced exactly this calculus before. Marjah. The extraction. The 18 men whose lives were worth more than the mission objectives the Pentagon had decided to pursue. She'd made the call then despite the orders, despite the consequences, despite knowing what it would cost her. She'd do it again. The question was how, now that she'd been stripped of her access, isolated from her allies, officially branded as unreliable and potentially dangerous. But that was a problem she could solve. She'd solved worse ones with less resources and more people actively trying to kill her. A hospital administrator and a restricted access code were nothing compared to that. Vickers began seizing during the 2:15 a.m. vital check. His oxygen saturation plummeted from 94 to 78 to 62 in the space of 4 seconds. The monitor screamed its electronic panic, a sound like a car alarm in a cathedral. Megan was checking his full line when his entire body went rigid, muscles tensing against the hospital bed rails with the force of defibrillator paddles applied without electricity. His chest collapsed inward. Not expanding. Collapsing. The left side of his torso caved like a building imploding. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space compressing his lung, crushing his heart, strangling his ability to breathe. She'd seen it twice before, both times in a Black Hawk helicopter over the Helmand province where there were no surgeons and the nearest facility was 40 minutes away if you flew low and fast. She didn't reach for the crash cart. She didn't call for a resident. Her hand went to her boot, the laces still military tight after 17 years, and the combat knife came free without sound. 14-gauge angiocath needle wouldn't work here. This needed penetration. This needed air release. The needle decompression would buy maybe 90 seconds before the pressure built again. The only real solution was opening the chest cavity and reinflating the lung manually. Bilateral finger thoracotomy. Emergency cricothyrotomy. Or the field thoracotomy she'd performed 17 times in conditions infinitely worse than this, in dust storms, under fire, with nothing but a knife and hand steady from muscle memory that never forgot. The knife blade went between his ribs, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, exactly as the army had taught her in a desert tent in 2010. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already done this when the alternative was watching a man die in your arms. The residents watching from the doorway made sounds, a gasp, a sharp intake, but they didn't move. They were frozen in the way people freeze when they witness something that violates every protocol they've learned, when the rules of medicine and procedure collide with the raw necessity of survival. Dr. Chen, the night shift supervisor, had her phone halfway to her mouth to call security, then lowered it. Some part of her brain recognized what was happening. Some part of her understood this wasn't a nurse with a knife. This was a trained operative performing a procedure with the calm of someone who had done this before. The incision opened. Blood and fluid poured across Vickers' chest, the smell of copper and antiseptic mixing into something metallic and wrong. Megan's fingers went into the chest cavity, no hesitation, no tremor, and felt for the collapsed lung. The texture was wrong, like a deflated balloon that had been crumpled and left in a corner. She found the hilum, the root of the lung where the vessels and bronchus clustered like a tangle of cord, and her fingers moved with the absolute certainty of hands that had held lives together before. She reinflated manually. Her hand became the bellows that his own lungs could no longer be. She breathed for him the way she'd breathed for 18 men on February 17, 2013, when a mission went sideways in Marjah and someone had to make a choice that would end careers but save souls. O2 sat climbed. 62, 71. 81, 88. The monitor's screen reduced to a manageable beep. His heart rate stabilized. 1 second stretched into 10. 10 became 30. The panic drained from the room like water from a basin, leaving behind something heavier, silent so thick you could operate in it. Dr. Chen's face had gone pale, not from the blood or the procedure, but from the realization of what she was witnessing. This wasn't a frightened nurse improvising. This was a surgical intervention performed with the precision of someone who'd been trained by the best military medicine had to offer. Then the footsteps came. Fast. Authoritative. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway with security 2 steps behind him, and he stopped dead when he saw Megan standing over Vickers with blood running down her right forearm and wrist, the combat knife still in her other hand, her scrub stained dark with fluid and plasma. For 3 seconds, a lifetime in hospital time, he stared. His face went through a cascade of expressions. Confusion. Realization. Rage. Then something colder. Something tactical. He didn't look at the patient. He didn't ask if Caldwell was stable. He looked at Megan standing there with the knife and blood on her hands and saw exactly what he needed to see. Not a nurse saving a patient. A nurse with a weapon. A potential threat to safety. A precedent. Security, he said, and his voice was like ice forming on a windshield. Escort this employee from the premises. Now. Do not let her touch anything else. Do not let her speak to staff. Remove her hospital credentials and run a final background check for stolen valor and carrying a concealed weapon in a medical facility. He turned his back to them without waiting for a response, already pulling his phone from his pocket, already dialing. She heard the first words, "Yes, this is Dr. Caldwell. I need to speak to HR about an immediate termination for cause," as the security officer, a man with kind eyes and the exhausted bearing of someone who'd worked third shift for too long, gently took her elbow. She didn't resist. Megan walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital with blood still wet on her hands and no explanation to give. The knife she returned to her boot in the parking lot, wiping the blade on her scrub pants without a second thought. She'd broken no law. She'd saved a life. And it had cost her everything. That night she drove to Cedar Hill Cemetery in the rain. The headstones gleamed like teeth in the dark. Water hammered the cemetery like applause for the dead, and she stood at plot B47 where the stone read, David O'Brien, loving father, 1981 to 2019. 17 years married. 17 years of watching her pretend the Pentagon hadn't erased her. 17 years of watching her disappear a little more every day until she was barely there even when she was standing in the same room. He died of pneumonia that should have been treatable because she couldn't get him the right care, because going to a regular hospital meant her name might surface, meant questions might be asked, meant the people who'd ordered her to vanish might track her down. "I couldn't even save the man who destroyed me," Megan whispered to the stone. The rain ran down her face like grief had learned to move in rivulets. "I failed you. I failed our son. I failed everyone." She stood there for 20 minutes, then drove home through streets that belonged to a different life. The house was dark except for one porch light. Connor was waiting on the steps, 17 years old and bearing the careful expressions of a child who'd learned to read his mother's silences. In his hands was a show box, weathered and dust-covered. She recognized it immediately. The attic. The locked trunk she'd told him never to touch. What did you do? Her voice came out flat. I went looking for answers. Connor opened the box with the care of someone handling relics. Silver Star. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Distinguished Service Cross. The medals of a major in the United States Army, awarded for things that never happened, for a woman who technically didn't exist. Mom, I'm not 7. I'm not a child anymore. And I'm tired of you disappearing. He closed the box and met her eyes. Tomorrow morning there's a hospital board meeting. I'm bringing these. I'm showing them who you actually are. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sacred Heart Human Resources. She read it once. Then again. Termination effective immediately. Return all hospital property. Do not return to premises. Fired for saving a life with her hands. Erased again, the way the Pentagon had erased her, the way the world had been erasing her since 2013. She looked at her son, the only real thing she'd built, the only evidence that she'd ever truly existed, and for the first time in 17 years, she let someone see her break. The showbox hit the conference table like a grenade. Connor O'Brien didn't ask permission. He walked past Sacred Heart security at 7 in the morning carrying cardboard and certainty, 17 years old with his mother's jaw and his father's stubborn silence. The administrator's office was already occupied. Dr. Caldwell sat across from Richard Hayes, the hospital board chair, their coffee cooling untouched as they reviewed the formal paperwork for Megan's termination. Neither man had expected a teenager. Connor opened the box. The metal spilled across polished mahogany like scattered light. Silver Star first. Then Bronze Star. Then 2 purple hearts fanned like accusatory fingers. The room went dead silent. My mother is Major Megan O'Brien, Connor said, his voice cracking exactly once before he controlled it. And you all just fired a decorated combat veteran. Dr. Caldwell's face drained the color of old bone. The head nurse from the ceremony team, Patricia Chen, had been called in as a witness. She stood by the window, and when she saw the medals, her hands trembled. She reached for the citation that Connor laid beside them, the official Army document with its presidential seal and scrolling text. Her voice shook as she read, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Major Megan Marie O'Brien, Medical Corps, Army Aviation, willingly and knowingly landed her UH-60M Black Hawk helicopter in a hot zone during an active extraction, against direct orders from command, thereby preventing the loss of 18 American servicemen and 1 Allied interpreter during Operation Enduring Freedom, Marjah District, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, June 2013. Patricia lowered the paper. Her eyes were wet. She was a pilot. A helicopter pilot. The door opened. Not knocked. Opened. Colonel James Webb walked in with 4 soldiers at his 6, all of them in dress uniforms, all of them moving with the controlled precision of men used to killing and saving lives in equal measure. Webb had a scar that pulled the left side of his face tight, a man reconstructed by surgery and refusal. His presence made the air pressure change, made the room itself seem to shrink around his certainty. Major Megan O'Brien received the Distinguished Service Cross for Marjah, Webb said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and capable of terrible acceleration. She saved my entire platoon when she refused to leave us behind. I have spent the last 6 months trying to find her. Instead, I find her working as a nurse while a man with a psychiatric disorder and access to classified files was systematically poisoning her patient to cover his own crimes. Richard Hayes had already gone pale. Dr. Caldwell stood, his hands raised in the gesture of a man trying to negotiate with gravity. This is a misunderstanding. I was following hospital protocol. The patient was unidentified. The patient, said a woman in a navy suit stepping through the door behind Webb, is Colonel James Vickers, retired. And the investigation into him uncovered something far more interesting. She placed an FBI credentials case on the table. Dr. Caldwell, you have been under federal investigation for 18 months for espionage. Medical records. Patient files of classified operatives. You've been selling them. The Iranians paid you $47,000 for Colonel Vickers' treatment protocols. The Chinese paid $93,000 for the medical records of 3 active-duty SEAL team operators who'd come through Sacred Heart after deployment. Dr. Caldwell sat down. His hands moved to his lap like they belonged to someone else. The FBI agent continued, "The background check you initiated on Major O'Brien, the one designed to expose her, to destroy her, to eliminate a witness, triggered federal security alerts because you accessed classified files without authorization while conducting it. Your own investigation unraveled your entire network. Your greed destroyed you. And your greed protected the hero you were trying to discard." Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The Rangers moved as one organism, standing at attention on either side of the door. This wasn't a crime scene anymore. This was a reckoning. By noon, Dr. Caldwell was in custody. By evening, every staff member who'd participated in Megan's humiliation was being interviewed by federal agents. The break room that had gone silent when she entered now buzzed with frantic whispers, nurses realizing they'd enabled espionage, residents understanding that their silence had made them complicit. Patricia Chen was crying at the nurses' station, her voice breaking. "I saw her name on that board. I didn't question it. I should have questioned it. I should have." She couldn't finish. The trauma surgeons reviewed the thoracotomy. One of them, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a cardiothoracic specialist with 30 years of experience, watched the video of what Megan had done. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "That's textbook battlefield medicine. Third intercostal space, exact angle, perfect execution. She saved his life in 4 minutes." 4 minutes! Most people would have waited for the crash cart and lost him. Megan was reinstated by noon the next day. Full back pay. Formal apology. And a promotion that came from the hospital board itself, not from Caldwell's department, Director of Emergency Medicine, effective immediately. Richard Hayes delivered it personally in the hallway, his handshake damp with sweat and regret. "We're establishing a protocol," he said. "Any classified military personnel coming through these doors, full privacy protection. Full access restrictions. And any attempt to access those files without authorization triggers an automatic security alert to federal law enforcement. We should have done this years ago." Megan nodded once. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Colonel Vickers was awake. That afternoon, with Webb standing in the doorway and 2 Rangers posted outside, Megan entered his ICU room. The mute Ranger was sitting up now, his eyes tracking her the instant she appeared. When he saw her in person, not as a phantom in his fractured memory, but solid and breathing and real, tears began streaming down his face. She sat beside his bed. Her uniform was crisp. Her captain's bars caught the fluorescent light like warnings. "I'm sorry I disobeyed orders in Marjah, Colonel," she said quietly. "I'm sorry it cost you your command. I'm sorry the hearing destroyed your career." Vickers shook his head with surprising violence. He reached for the notepad beside his bed, his hand moving with the jerky determination of someone whose nervous system had been rewired by explosive force. He wrote in letters that wavered but held meaning, "You were right. I was wrong. Thank you." Megan reached out and gripped his hand. No trembling. No tears. Just the steadiness of someone who had learned to carry impossible weights. "You're safe now, Colonel. No one's going to hurt you again." 6 months passed. Megan stood in her army dress uniform at Sacred Heart's commemoration ceremony honoring military medical personnel. The new trauma center bore a bronze plaque, "In honor of those who serve without borders, heal without hesitation, and give their lives to others." The local news was filming. Connor sat in the front row beside Colonel Webb and the Rangers who'd flown in from Fort Campbell. Richard Hayes presented her with the formal apology and the promotion certificate, but everyone understood that the real ceremony wasn't happening here. It was happening in the moment Megan walked back through the hospital doors as something other than erased. Colonel Vickers was there in a wheelchair. His speech had improved enough that he could manage 3 words, "thank you, yes, and no." He held up a handwritten sign with letters that he'd practiced for weeks. "Thank you, Major, you saved me twice." The staff gave a standing ovation. Megan saw the faces in the crowd, Patricia Chen red-eyed and clapping, the residents who'd frozen during the crisis now taking notes as she was introduced as their new director, the nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room now applauding a woman they were finally seeing clearly. Patricia approached afterward, her shoulders rounded with the weight of what she hadn't done. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm ashamed." Megan looked at her. Really looked. Not at who Patricia had been, but at who she might become. "I need competent nurses who ask questions. Can you do that?" Patricia nodded, crying harder. "Yes. I can do that." Later, someone from the news asked Megan what she'd learned from the experience. She stood in the hallway outside Vickers' room, her son beside her, her medals on the wall behind her framed in glass that caught and held the light like small suns. She thought about Dr. Caldwell, who was working night security at a strip mall clinic in Galveston now, his medical license revoked, his pension frozen, the very investigation he'd launched to eliminate her having destroyed everything he'd built. She thought about the medals that had been buried in her attic for 7 years, the identity she'd been forced to hide, the cost of keeping her head down in a world that wanted her to vanish. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she said quietly. The camera caught Connor's hand gripping hers. It caught Colonel Webb nodding slowly. It caught Colonel Vickers with his hand raised in something that might have been a salute, his tears dried now, his eyes steady as stone. It caught Megan herself, no longer trembling, no longer erased, no longer invisible, looking directly at the camera with the unshakable presence of someone who had already survived everything the world could throw at her, who had stood in the fire and refused to burn, and who had learned that the greatest act of courage isn't the moment you save someone's life. It's the moment you let them see that you were never broken at all. Just waiting. If Major Megan O'Brien's story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made invisible by someone with power, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to know that hidden strength doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous. Drop a comment. Have you ever judged someone before knowing their whole story? And if you want more stories about the warriors walking among us, the ones in scrubs and dog tags and ordinary clothes who do extraordinary things when no one's watching, hit that notification bell. Because the best stories aren't the ones told in headlines. They're the ones whispered in hospital corridors, the ones that change everything in 4 minutes, the ones that remind us all that heroes look like nurses sometimes.